The coffee was still hot when my son-in-law told me I should think about transferring the lake house into his name. Not suggested, told. I remember setting the mug down on the kitchen counter very carefully, the way you do when your hands aren't entirely steady and you don't want anyone to notice. The morning light was coming through the window above the sink, hitting the surface of Lake Champlain out beyond the dock, making the water look like hammered silver. I'd looked at that view for 31 years. Built the house myself, or near enough, hired the crew, picked every beam, stood in the mud in rubber boots, watching the foundation pour in October of 1994. Catherine was pregnant with our daughter then, wearing my flannel shirt because nothing else fit, handing me coffee from a thermos, and laughing when I got concrete on my shoes. I thought about all of that in the 2 seconds before I answered him. "That's an interesting idea," I said. "Let me think on it." He smiled. The kind of smile that tells you the person wearing it has already decided the answer. His name was Garrett. I won't pretend I disliked him from the start. That would be too clean, too simple. When my daughter Elise first brought him home 6 years ago, I thought he was charming in the way that men who have learned to be charming tend to be. Firm handshake, remembered details, called me sir exactly the right number of times, before switching to my first name like we'd always been close. His family was from Connecticut, old money that had gotten newer and then gotten old again in the way that some families manage. He wore it lightly, or seemed to. I had built mine from nothing. That might be the thing Garrett never fully understood, or maybe understood too well. I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years building a civil engineering firm from a 2-man operation in a rented office in Burlington into something that employed 240 people and held contracts across 7 states. When I sold it 14 months ago, the number that appeared in my account was the kind of number I had never spoken out loud, not even to Catherine before she died, because it felt like tempting something. $8.4 million after taxes, fees, and the buyout I insisted on for my 3 senior partners, because those men had given me decades, and I wasn't going to let them walk away with handshakes. Catherine didn't live to see the sale close. She died 22 months before that, a Tuesday in March, a brain aneurysm that the doctors said she likely never felt. I have chosen to believe that. There is no alternative that I can bear. After she was gone, the firm kept me upright, gave me somewhere to be at 6 in the morning, gave me problems that had solutions. When I sold it, I had the money in the lake house and my daughter, and I thought, her husband. I had more than most men get. I knew that. I reminded myself of it on the bad mornings, the ones where I'd walk out to the dock before sunrise and stand there in the cold watching the water and missing Catherine so badly it felt like a physical absence, like a tooth pulled and the tongue keeps finding the gap. The sale closed in September. By November, Garrett had started the conversations. They didn't announce themselves as what they were. That's the thing I want you to understand. If he had sat down across from me and said, "I want your money and I'm working out how to get it," I would have shown him the door. But that's not how it works. It was questions at first, casual, curious, seated around the table after Sunday dinner with Elise in the kitchen, making coffee and the football game on low in the background. Have you thought about the tax implications of holding that much in a standard account? Have you looked at restructuring the lake house as an LLC? Could save you significant estate exposure. Have you updated your will since the sale? Because the thresholds have changed. He was a financial advisor. Did I mention that? Independent. His own small firm, 3 employees, clientele that ran mostly to inherited wealth and business owners approaching retirement. He was good at sounding like he was helping. Maybe because he had spent his whole career doing exactly that, sounding helpful while moving money in the direction he intended it to move. I answered his questions carefully and non-committally. I had my own advisors. My estate attorney, a woman named Ruth I had worked with for 15 years, had already restructured everything appropriately. I had a trust set up for Elise that bypassed probate entirely. I had made gifts within the annual exclusion limits. I had done the things that a man who spent 35 years reading contracts does when he has reason to think clearly. I did not tell Garrett any of this. At Christmas, he suggested I consider adding him as a co-trustee on the family trust for continuity. I said I'd bring it up with my attorney. He mentioned it again in February. I said the same thing. In March, he started talking about a property in Costa Rica that some clients of his, had purchased and turned into a boutique resort, and wasn't there something similar I'd always wanted to do with that capital rather than just letting it sit? I'd never said anything of the sort. By April, I had started writing things down. Not formally. Nothing that would alarm anyone. Just a small leather notebook I kept in the desk drawer in my study, the room off the back of the lake house where Catherine and I used to do puzzles on winter evenings. Every conversation. The date, who was present, what was said, what was implied. My engineering brain, I suppose, document everything, measure twice. I hadn't yet let myself name what I was afraid of. But I was keeping records. The trip to Montana was Elise's idea, which matters. I want to be clear about that, because later I had moments where I doubted everything, where I wondered if I had been wrong about all of it, and had turned ordinary greed into something darker than it was. But the trip was Elise's idea. She'd been talking about Glacier for years, ever since a college friend had done the Going to the Sun road, and sent back photographs that Elise had printed and stuck to the refrigerator. She wanted to do it for my birthday in August. The three of us. Father-daughter trip, she called it, then added Garrett almost as an afterthought, or that's how I read it at the time. We flew into Kalispell on a Thursday and drove up to a lodge that Garrett had chosen, which surprised me. I'd expected Elise to handle the planning. The lodge was beautiful. Timber frame, high ceilings, a long porch looking out toward the mountains. The kind of place that makes you feel, for the first 20 minutes, that everything in the world is fundamentally okay. The first day was fine. We hiked the easier trails. Elise got a blister and we stopped at the lodge gift shop for better socks. Garrett bought everyone drinks on the porch at sunset and said it was his treat, generously, like a man who expects to be remembered for it. The second day, he suggested Grinnell Glacier. It's not a casual hike. 7.5 miles round trip, 1,200 feet of elevation. The trail runs along the edge of Lake Josephine and then climbs, and at the upper sections there are places where you're walking a narrow path with a serious drop on one side. I've hiked difficult terrain. I ran 3 mornings a week and kept myself in reasonable shape for a man my age. But I noticed that Garrett brought it up when Elise had gone inside, just the two of us on the porch with our coffee, and I noticed that he mentioned it again at dinner, phrasing it as a thing I might want to prove I could still do. My birthday was the following day. I've done harder, I said, which was true. He smiled the smile. We started out at 7:30 in the morning. The trail was everything the photographs promised. The water impossibly blue, the peaks reflecting in it, the kind of landscape that makes you feel simultaneously significant and small. Elise was ahead of us most of the morning, stopping to take pictures, calling back to point out flowers she'd looked up in the field guide app on her phone. I could hear how happy she was. It sounded like the way she'd laughed as a little girl, uninhibited, slightly too loud. Catherine used to say she got that from me. Garrett stayed beside me. At first it was normal. The trail wasn't wide enough for 3 abreast, and Elise was moving faster than we were. But I started to notice that he was steering. Small suggestions about where to step, which side to take, why I should move to the outer edge to get a better view. Each one reasonable on its own. Together a pattern. We were at one of the upper sections. The trail bent around a rock face, and on the outer edge there was a drop. Not vertical, but steep, rocky, the kind of fall you don't walk away from. Elise was perhaps 40 yards ahead and had stopped to photograph something and had her back to us. Garrett said, "Come look at this. The light on the upper glacier is incredible right now." And he stepped to the outer edge and gestured, and I followed partly because I wasn't thinking, and partly because 30 years of building things had made me a man who looks at what someone points to. It's a reflex, and in the moment his hand left my shoulder blade. I understood what was happening, but I was already moving. I went down about 8 feet before my left hand caught a rock ledge that jutted out from the slope. Not a railing, not a safety feature, a piece of mountain that happened to be there. My shoulder wrenched hard, badly enough that I felt it through the shock. I pressed myself flat against the slope, fingers locked on the rock, and I did not make a sound. Above me I heard Garrett's voice. Calm, already performing for the distance. He slipped. Oh God, he went over. Elise, come here, your father. I think he fell, I think. There was nothing I could do, he just went to look at the view and the edge gave way. And then Elise screaming my name. I stayed still. I don't fully understand my own reasoning in those seconds. Shock, maybe, or something colder and more deliberate that I hadn't known I was capable of. But I pressed myself against the rock and I listened, and what I heard was Garrett managing the scene. telling Elise not to get close to the edge. It was unstable. Telling her they needed to get back to where there was cell service and call for help. Saying, in a voice that was already slightly wrong, too composed, too ready, that he couldn't see me below, that the slope was steep, that it didn't look good. He didn't look long. They moved back down the trail. Garrett had his arm around Elise, holding her up, or holding her away. I couldn't tell from where I was, and I have thought about that moment more times than I can count. I held on until they were gone. Then, very slowly, I began to move. The slope below the ledge was steep but not sheer. I worked my way across it, horizontal, using every foothold I could find, the way I'd scrambled on job sites 30 years ago before anyone used the word liability. My shoulder was bad. My right knee hit a rock at one point, and I felt the warmth of blood through my pants. I was not thinking about any of that. I was thinking about getting to a place where I could sit and figure out what came next. I found a shallow depression behind a boulder, 15 feet below the trail, and maybe 100 yards back from where I'd gone over. Out of sight. I sat down on the rock, pressed my back against the boulder, and I allowed myself 30 seconds to shake. Then I stopped. The phone in my jacket pocket had no signal, but it was intact. The portable battery pack I always hiked with. 35 years of being responsible for things that could go wrong had made me a compulsive preparer. Was in my pack. My pack had stayed on my back. I was 63 years old, with a wrenched shoulder, a bleeding knee, no signal, and a son-in-law who had just tried to kill me on a mountainside in Montana while my daughter's back was turned. I waited until I heard the search and rescue helicopter, far away at first, and then louder. I stayed where I was. I let them search. That might be the hardest thing to explain. Why I didn't call out, once they were up there. Why I lay in that depression behind the boulder in the late afternoon, and watched the light change and let my daughter believe I was dead. The honest answer is that I wasn't sure what I had. I had a wrenched shoulder and a scraped knee, and the memory of a hand on my shoulder blade, and a second where I understood what was happening. I didn't have a recording. I didn't have a witness. I had a son-in-law who would stand in front of a search and rescue team, and anyone else who asked and described a terrible accident, a father-in-law stepping too close to an unstable edge. A moment that happened so fast there was nothing he could do. He was good at seeming helpful. He was good at managing what people believed. If I came back now, it was his word against a 63-year-old widower who had perhaps gotten confused near a cliff edge. But if I waited, I'd been building things for 35 years. I knew how to read a site before you started digging. I knew what you had to see in order to know where to put the foundation. I needed to see where he moved next. I spent the night on the mountain. That's not a thing I'm proud of in terms of the worry it caused. The worry it caused Elise especially, who, I learned, later spent the night at the lodge with a park ranger stationed outside her door and a grief counselor on the phone from Kalispell. I'm not proud of that, but I needed the night to think, and I needed Garrett to believe it was over. In the morning I made my way down on my own, following a drainage creek that my compass told me would eventually reach the valley floor. It took 4 hours. My shoulder had stiffened overnight, and the knee was ugly but not structural. I came out of the tree line onto a fire road and followed it, until I reached a maintenance outpost, with a landline telephone mounted on the wall and a laminated card of emergency numbers. I called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff. I did not call my daughter. I explained that I was alive and uninjured enough to be mobile, that I needed to speak with someone about the circumstances of my fall before anything else happened. The deputy who came was young, maybe 30, the kind of young that makes 63 feel like another species. He listened more carefully than I expected. I asked him how long it would take the news that I was alive to reach the search operation. He said they could hold it for a little while if there was a reason. I told him there was a reason. Then I called Ruth, my estate attorney, from the deputy's cell phone. It was a Wednesday morning, and she was in her office, where she has been every Wednesday morning for 15 years. I told her what had happened. I told her what I needed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Stay where you are. Don't talk to anyone else until I've made 2 calls." What I did not know, sitting in that maintenance outpost with the deputy's jacket over my shoulders because I'd been cold since approximately 6 the previous evening, was what Garrett had done in the 14 hours since he'd walked my daughter off that mountain. He had called his own attorney, not about the fall, not yet, not formally. But he had made a call which the attorney later confirmed to discuss, hypothetically, the process by which a surviving spouse of a deceased estate holder might access funds that were held in trust. His wife was not the surviving spouse. He was the spouse of the surviving child. That's a critical distinction. And the trust Ruth had set up protected against exactly the scenario he was asking about. But the fact that he made the call that same evening, before my body had been recovered, that was something. The deputy helped me understand the jurisdictional process. The county sheriff's office, the park service, the way a report would be filed. I was careful. I was precise. I described everything I could remember about the hand on my shoulder, the timing, the angle, the words he said, the fact that he had moved me to the outer edge through a series of small suggestions across an entire morning. I described the notebook I had been keeping at home, the dated entries, the records of every financial conversation since November. They listened. They did not dismiss me. They took a formal statement. Ruth arrived in Kalispell the following afternoon. She is 71 years old and has the bearing of someone who has never once been uncertain about which way to walk into a room. She sat across from me in the conference room of the local attorney's office she had arranged, and she put her reading glasses on, and she looked at me for a moment in silence. "How's the shoulder?" she said. "Manageable," I said. "Good." She opened her folder. "Now let's talk about what we're going to do." The decision about when to tell Elise was the hardest decision I have ever made. Harder than the sale, harder than any contract I ever signed. Because I knew that the moment I told her I was alive, the grief she had been carrying for 36 hours would become something different and more complicated, and I didn't know how much of it would land on me for what I had done, and how much on the man she was married to for what he had done. Ruth's position was practical. We needed 48 more hours to document everything properly before anything went public. The sheriff's office agreed to keep my status restricted, pending notification of next of kin, which was technically accurate, since Elise was my only next of kin, and I was the one choosing not to notify her yet. I have not forgiven myself for those 48 hours. I want to say that plainly. On the third morning, Ruth and the deputy and I drove to the lodge. Garrett was in the lobby when we walked in. He had a coffee in his hand, and he was talking to the lodge manager about, I found out later, the process for arranging transport of a deceased person's personal effects back across state lines. He saw me, and the coffee hit the floor. I will not pretend I took no satisfaction in that. I will also not pretend it's the moment I think about most when I remember that week. The moment I think about most is the sound I heard from the hallway outside Elise's room, before she opened the door. A sharp intake of breath, a single broken sound that wasn't quite a word, and then her arms around me and the smell of her hair, the same shampoo she'd used since college, and the fact that she was shaking, and I was shaking, and we stood in that hallway for a long time before either of us could speak. "I thought you were gone," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." She pulled back and looked at me, really looked, the way Catherine used to when she was trying to determine if I was telling her the whole truth, and I could see her adding things up. The deputy behind me, Ruth's face, the fact that Garrett had not come into the hallway. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. The formal investigation took 6 weeks. The financial records Garrett had at his firm, the call to his attorney, the search history on his phone that his own legal team eventually had to disclose. It accumulated. My notebook from the lake house, which Ruth had retrieved and copied before anything else, provided the timeline. The Park Service reconstructed the section of trail where I'd gone over. Their report noted that the edge was not, in their assessment, structurally unstable. Garrett maintained it was an accident. He maintained it for weeks, right up until his own attorney told him what the evidence looked like from the outside, and asked him, apparently, what he wanted to do next. He accepted a plea agreement. Charges were reduced in exchange for full cooperation with the financial investigation, which had by then expanded to include several of his other clients. Older ones, widowers and widows, people who had trusted him because he was good at seeming trustworthy. I was not the first person he had moved in a direction he intended their money to go. I was apparently the first one who had noticed early enough to keep records. The civil settlement came later. Elise filed. I did not try to stop her. There are things I can tell you now, from this distance, that I could not have told you in that maintenance outpost, with the deputy's jacket on my shoulders. I can tell you that the lake house looks the same in the mornings, the water still going silver before the sun gets fully up, Still the view Catherine stood in front of in my flannel shirt 30 years ago. I can tell you that Elise calls me every Sunday and sometimes drives up on weekends, and we've started doing the puzzles again, the ones in the cabinet in the study, the same cabinet where I kept the notebook. I can tell you that I understand, more than I once did, why Catherine always said I was too careful, too deliberate, too methodical, always measuring twice. She said it with affection. She thought it was my professional self leaking into the personal. But sitting on that mountain in the dark, running through everything I knew and everything I would need, I was grateful for every one of those habits. The notebook, the battery pack, the compass that was in my jacket pocket because I always put a compass in my jacket pocket on a trail, because you never know. The decision I made in that hollow behind the boulder, to stay quiet, to wait, to build the case the same way I'd always built things, carefully, from the ground up. That decision cost me 36 hours of my daughter's grief that I will never be able to give back. But it cost Garrett everything he had been working toward. Some things you measure, some things you build, and some foundations, once you dig them right, hold for a very long time.